slid divorce papers toward his pregnant wife and asked his mistress to move in that very night. His father nodded approval. His mother smiled. Nobody spoke for the woman carrying his child. None of them realized the empire they were celebrating had belonged to her bloodline all along. The dining room glowed warm that evening. Candles burned on the long table. Plates clinked. Laughter rose and fell like music. To anyone passing by the window, it looked like a happy family enjoying a good night together. But Thandi knew better. She sat near the end of the table, both hands resting gently on her belly. 7 months along. The baby moved, slow and sure, and she pressed her palm there to feel it. That small movement was the only warmth she felt in that whole bright room. Across from her, her husband Obadele laughed too loudly at something his father said. He always laughed loudest when he wanted attention. Beside him sat his mother, Mama Ngozi, sharp-eyed and proud, watching Thandi the way a hawk watches something small on the ground. And at the far corner, dressed in red, smiling like she already owned the house, sat a woman Thandi had only met twice. Fola said, the woman her husband called a business partner, the woman who looked at Obadele the way a wife should be looked at. Thandi said nothing. She had learned that silence often saw more than noise ever could. She had felt the change for months, the way Obadele's eyes slid past her now, the late nights, the phone he turned face down on the table, the way Mama Ngozi had started talking about her son's future, as if Thandi were not sitting right there in the room. A woman knows. A woman always knows, long before the words ever come. She had simply been praying she was wrong. Tonight, in that warm and glowing room, she was about to learn just how wrong she had not been. She caught Folasade watching her from the corner. The woman in red lifted her glass an inch, just toward Thandi, and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who already knew how the night would end. Thandi held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, down at her belly, where her child stirred as if it too could feel the cold creeping into the room. The food was good, the wine was poured, stories were told, and through all of it, that strange tension hummed beneath the table, the way a wire hums right before it snaps. And then Obadele stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon. The table quieted. Everyone turned to him, smiling, waiting for a toast. Thandi smiled too, out of habit, out of hope. But Obadele did not raise a glass. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded set of papers. He placed them on the table and slid them slowly toward Thandi, past the candles, past the half-eaten plates, until they stopped in front of her. "Open it," he said. She looked at the papers, then at him. Her hands did not move. "I said open it," he repeated, calm, almost bored. Slowly, she unfolded them. The words at the top hit her like cold water. Divorce. Dissolution of marriage. Her name printed in plain black ink, sitting there as if it were nothing. The room did not gasp. That was the strange part. They did not gasp. "I want to be honest with everyone tonight," Obadele said, turning to face his family. "I have grown. I have changed. And the truth is, this marriage no longer fits the life I am building." He turned then and held out his hand. Folasade rose from her corner like she had been waiting all night for this exact moment. She walked around the table, slid her hand into his, and stood beside him with a smile that did not even try to hide itself. "Folasade will be moving in tonight," Obadele announced. "I expect everyone to welcome her the way she deserves." Thandi waited for someone to speak, someone to stand, someone to say, "What is wrong with you? She is carrying your child." Instead, Babatunde, her husband's father, set down his glass, nodded slowly, and said, "Finally, a woman with vision." Mama Ngozi clapped her hands together softly and laughed. "The best decision you have made in years, my son." And just like that, the table lifted their glasses. To Obadel, to Folasad, to the future. Nobody lifted a glass to the pregnant woman sitting alone at the end, holding divorce papers in her trembling hands. Thandi looked at each of them, one by one. At Obadele, who would not meet her eyes. At Baba Tunde, who looked at her the way a man looks at an old chair he is finally throwing out. At Mama Ngozi, who had once held her hand at the wedding and called her a blessing, now smiling at the woman in red. At Folasad, who looked back at her with open triumph, as if to say, "You see how easy that was." Years of her life sat in that room. The meals she had cooked, the debts she had quietly paid, the nights she had stayed up worrying about a family that now toasted her removal like good news. And not one of them, not a single one, thought she was worth a word of kindness on the night they cut her loose. She looked down at her belly, at the child who would be born into all of this. Then back at the table of smiling faces. Not one of them met her eyes for long. To them, she was already gone, already replaced, already forgotten. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She did not wipe it away in a rush. She let it fall, slow and quiet, and she let them see it. Let them think it was the end of her. Then something inside her went still. Not broken. Still. Like the moment before a storm, when the wind stops and the whole world holds its breath. She folded the napkin in her lap. She placed it neatly on the table beside her untouched plate. And she stood, one hand under her belly, her back straighter than it had been in years. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply looked at her husband and said, in a voice so calm it almost frightened her, "Is that all?" Obadele blinked, caught off guard. "Yes," he said. "That is all." "Good," she said. And she reached into her purse, her fingers brushing past her keys until they touched an old envelope. A sealed envelope, soft at the corners from being carried so long. She did not take it out. She only touched it, the way you touch something that gives you strength. Then she let it go, closed her purse, and walked out of that dining room without looking back. Behind her, the family kept laughing. They thought the show was over. They had no idea it had not even begun. To understand why Thandi could stay so calm while her whole life burned, you have to go back. Back before the big house. Back before the fine clothes and the long table. Back to a small town where the roads were dust and the nights were full of stars. Thandi grew up the only daughter of a quiet man named Solomon. He was not a loud father. He did not give speeches. He showed his love in small ways, in the way he fixed her shoes when they tore, in the way he saved the best piece of fruit for her without a word. People in the town did not know much about Solomon. They knew he left early in the morning and came home late. They knew he wore the same two coats for years. They thought he was just another hard-working man scraping by. What they did not know was who Solomon really was. There were small clues, if anyone had cared to look. The way important men in fine cars would sometimes stop by their modest home late at night and speak to Solomon in low voices, then leave, looking relieved. The way he could read a contract faster than a lawyer. The way, when the town's only school was about to close, the money to save it appeared from nowhere, and Solomon only smiled when people wondered aloud where it had come from. But little Thandi did not know any of that, and her father liked it that way. But little Thandi did not know either. To her, he was just Daddy. The man who taught her how to listen more than she spoke. The man who told her, again and again, words she would carry her whole life. Loud men inherit nothing, he would say, sitting on the porch in the evening. Patient hands inherit everything. Remember that, my girl. The world will try to make you small. Do not let it make you bitter. Stay soft. Soft is not weak. Soft is strong enough to bend without breaking. She was 12 when she truly understood he was sick. He hid it well, the way he hid everything. By the time she was 19, the man who taught her patience was lying thin in a bed, his hand still warm in hers. The night he passed, he pressed something into her palm, an envelope, sealed with a small wax mark, the kind she had never seen him use before. "Do not open this," he whispered, "until they make you feel like you are nothing, until you sit in a room full of people who think you are small. On that day, and not before, open it. You will know the day when it comes." She cried and told him she would never feel like nothing, not as long as she remembered him. He smiled, weak but warm. "You will feel it," he said, "and when you do, this will remind you who you are." Those were among his last words. Thandi kept that envelope for years, through college, where she paid her own way, through the lonely apartments, through the day she met a charming, ambitious young man named Obadeli, who made her laugh and made her feel chosen. She married him, believing in love, and in the early years, she gave him everything. When his small business struggled, she quietly covered the gaps, selling a few things her father had left her, telling Obadel the money came from savings. When his family needed help, she paid for it and never spoke of it again. She fed his parents at her own table. She nursed Mama Ngozi through a long illness, sleeping in a chair by her bed for weeks, and received nothing but complaints about how the soup was too salty. She smiled through Baba Tunde's lectures about how a real woman gives her husband sons. She stayed soft, the way her father taught her. She told herself it was love. She told herself that if she was good enough, patient enough, kind enough, they would one day see her. Love makes us believe strange things. It makes us pour ourselves into people who only know how to take. And the whole time, the envelope sat in the bottom of her purse, unopened, waiting. She used to wonder what was inside. A letter, maybe. A few kind words. A small keepsake to remember him by. She never imagined it was the key to everything. She only knew her father told her to wait. So, she waited. Through the good years and the cold ones. Through the love that slowly turned to indifference. Through the way Obadele began to look at her like she was furniture instead of a wife. Soft is not weak, her father had said. She was about to find out just how strong soft could be. The days after that dinner were the hardest Thandi had ever known. Obadel did not even pretend anymore. By the next morning, Folisade's things were arriving at the house in boxes and bags, carried in by movers while Thandi stood in the hallway, still in her robe, still carrying his child. "You can stay in the small room until you find somewhere," Obadele said, not even looking up from his phone. "But do not get comfortable. This is Folisade's home now." Folisade walked past her in the hall, trailing perfume, and smiled. "Do be careful on the stairs," she said sweetly. "In your condition, a fall would be such a tragedy." Thandi said nothing. She went to the small room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and breathed slowly, one hand on her belly, telling the baby it was all right, even when it was not. Mama Ngozi came by that week, as she always did. But this time she did not even greet Thandi. She walked straight to Folasade, took her hands, and called her my daughter. She looked at Thandi only once, and her eyes were full of something colder than dislike. They were full of dismissal. The locks are being changed, Mama Ngozi announced. Folasade should feel safe in her own home. That night, Thandi tried her key in the side door. It did not turn. They had changed the locks while she was inside, like she was a thief in a house she had kept alive for years. Baba Tunde found her in the kitchen later, sitting alone in the dark. "You should be grateful," he said. "My son is being generous. Most men would have put you out already. That child you carry will not carry our name, you understand. We are a family of standing. We cannot attach ourselves to a woman with nothing behind her." A woman with nothing behind her. Thandi almost laughed. Almost. But she only nodded and let him believe it. Because that was the cruelest part. They truly believed she was nothing. They had spent years living well, and somewhere in their minds they thought it was all because of Obadeli, his cleverness, his name, his family, standing. They never asked why the business survived the bad years. They never asked whose quiet money had filled the holes. They never asked anything, because asking would mean admitting they owed her something. Thandi went numb. There is a kind of pain that screams and a kind that goes silent. Hers went silent. She moved through the house like a ghost. She ate little. She slept less. She would sit by the window in the small room and watch the life she had built carry on without her. Folasade's laughter floating up the stairs, the sound of Obadele's voice warm in a way it had not been warm with her in years. She wondered, in the darkest hours, if her father had been wrong. If soft really was just weak after all. She had been soft her whole life, and where had it brought her? To a narrow bed, in a borrowed room, carrying a child whose own father would not look at her. Maybe the loud ones had it right. Maybe the world really did belong to people like Folasade, who took what they wanted and never apologized. She thought about her child, growing inside her, who would come into a world that had already decided its mother was nothing. The thought was almost more than she could bear. She pressed both hands to her belly in the dark and made a silent promise. Whatever happened to her, this child would know they were wanted. This child would never sit at a table and feel like a stranger. One night, sitting on the floor of the small room with her back against the cold wall, she finally took the envelope from her purse and held it in both hands. The wax seal was still unbroken. Her father's voice came back to her, clear as the night he spoke it. "Until they make you feel like you are nothing." She looked around the dark little room, the room they had pushed her into, in a house where she was no longer welcome, carrying a child no one wanted, called a woman with nothing behind her. If this was not the day, there would never be one. Her thumb found the edge of the seal, and then her phone rang. She almost did not answer, but the number was unfamiliar, and something made her pick up. "Is this Thandi?" a careful, formal voice asked. "Daughter of the late Solomon?" Her breath caught. No one had spoken her father's name to her in years. "Yes," she whispered. "This is she." "My name is Mr. Okonkwo. I have been the executor of your father's estate for many years. I have been trying to reach you. We need to meet. There are matters your father left in your name. Important matters. Matters that can wait no longer." She sat very still, the phone pressed to her ear, the envelope in her other hand. "What kind of matters?" she asked. There was a pause on the line. "It is not something I can say over the phone," Mr. Okonkwo said gently. "But I think, when you understand, You will see that your father planned for this day a very long time ago. He always said you would call when the time was right. Has the time come, Thandi? She looked down at the unbroken seal in her hand. Yes, she said softly. I think it has. She slid her thumb under the wax. The seal cracked, and she began to read. The handwriting was her father's, careful and slow. My dear girl, it began. If you are reading this, then the day has come that I always feared and always knew would arrive. Someone has made you feel small. Someone has looked at my daughter and seen nothing. So now I will tell you the truth I kept from you, not to deceive you, but to protect you, so that you would grow up knowing love before you knew money, and would never confuse the two the way the world does. Thandi's hands began to shake as she read on. The letter told her things she had never imagined, about who her father truly was, about what he had built in silence over a lifetime, about the man named Okonkwo who would help her understand it all. And at the end, one last line that broke her open completely. You were always rich, my girl, not because of what I built, but because of who you are. The money is only a tool. Use it the way I taught you, quietly, kindly, and never, ever let it make you cruel. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Wait for the right moment, and then walk into that room and remember exactly whose daughter you are. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it against her chest and wept, there on the floor of that small, dark room. But they were not the same tears as before. These were tears of something coming back to life. The next morning, she called Mr. Okonkwo back, and she began, very quietly, to prepare. 2 weeks later, the house was full again. This time, it was a celebration. Obadel had decided to make it official, to show the whole family and their fine friends that Folasad was now the woman of the house. He called it an engagement party, though the divorce was not even final. He never cared much for the order of things, only for the look of them. The big dining room and the wide living space were decorated in gold and white. Caterers moved through with trays. Music played soft and rich. The family wore their best, and they wore their pride even higher. Baba Tunde stood near the center, a glass in his hand, telling an old friend about the family business as if he had built it himself. Mama Ngozi floated through the room, accepting compliments. Folasad wore white of all colors and laughed at every joke, her arm linked through Obadeli's. They had not seen Thandi in days. She had taken her few things and gone quietly, and they assumed she had crawled away to lick her wounds, out of sight, out of mind, exactly where they wanted her. So when the front door opened and Thandi walked in, the room slowly began to turn. She did not look like the woman they had pushed into a small dark room. She wore a deep blue dress, simple and elegant, her head high, her steps slow and certain. She still carried her belly, but she carried it now like a crown instead of a burden. There was something in the way she moved that had not been there before. A stillness, a certainty, the bearing of a woman who finally knew exactly who she was. And beside her walked an older man in a sharp gray suit, carrying a leather folder under his arm. Conversations died in pieces around the room. A woman near the door stopped mid-sentence. A waiter froze with a tray in his hands. One by one, the guests turned, drawn by that strange quiet that comes over a crowd when something important is about to happen. The music kept playing for a moment. Then someone turned it down. What is she doing here? Mama Ngozi hissed, loud enough to carry. Obadele set his jaw and stepped forward. You were not invited, he said. This is a private celebration. You need to leave. Thandi did not stop walking until she reached the center of the room where everyone could see her. "I will not take much of your time," she said, her voice calm and clear, filling the space without being raised. "But before this celebration goes on, there are some things this family should understand. Things you have never bothered to ask." "We do not need anything from you," Babatunde snapped. "You have nothing we want. You never did." The older man beside Thandi opened his leather folder. "My name is Mr. Okonkwo," he said. "I am the executor of the estate of the late Solomon, father of the woman standing beside me." He paused, letting the name settle. "Perhaps it would help if I explained exactly what that estate contains." Obadele rolled his eyes. "Her father was a poor old man from some dusty town. Whatever he left her, it does not concern us." Mr. Okonkwo looked at him for a long moment. "You are mistaken," he said quietly. "Solomon was not a poor man. Solomon was one of the most private and successful men this country has ever produced. He built his holdings quietly, under names most people never connected to him. Real estate, shipping, manufacturing, banking interests across 3 continents. He pulled out a single page and held it up. At the time of his passing, the value of his estate was assessed at $12 billion. The room went silent. Truly silent now. The kind of silence where you can hear a glass being set down very slowly. "That," Mr. Okonkwo continued, "is not money you spend in a lifetime. It is the kind of wealth that builds cities. And the will is clear. There is one heir, one sole heir to all of it." He turned and looked at Thandi. His daughter. Folasadi's smile had frozen on her face. Mama Ngozi's hand found the back of a chair. Babatunde's glass trembled, the wine inside catching the light. But Mr. Okonkwo was not finished. "There is more," he said, "and this part concerns all of you directly. The business your family has lived on for years, the company you, Babatunde, speak of as your own. It was failing 8 years ago. It would have collapsed. Someone bought up its debt quietly, kept it alive, funded it from the shadows, through a holding company owned in full by the estate of the late Solomon." He turned a page. "Which means," he said, "that the home you stand in, the business that pays for these decorations, the lifestyle every one of you enjoys, has been carried for years on the wealth of this woman's family. The woman you called a person with nothing behind her." No one breathed. Obadele's face had gone gray. "That is not possible," he managed. "I run that business. It is mine." "You run it," Mr. Okonkwo agreed. "You have never owned it. You manage assets that, by law, return to the estate, and the estate now answers to one person." Every eye in the room turned to Thandi. She looked at her husband. The man who had slid divorce papers across a table. The man who had pushed her into a small, dark room. The man who had stood with another woman on his arm and called her nothing in front of everyone she had tried so hard to love. "You asked me to leave that night," Thandi said softly. "You told me I brought nothing into this family. You let your father call my child nameless. You let this woman tell me to be careful on the stairs." She drew a slow breath. "I stayed silent because my father taught me that patient hands inherit everything. I did not know until 2 weeks ago just how true that was." She turned slowly, letting her eyes pass over each of them. Over Babatunde, whose proud face had gone slack. Over Mama Ngozi, gripping the chair. Over Folasade in her white dress, who suddenly looked very much like a guest who had wandered into the wrong house. "For 8 years," Thandi went on, I sat at your tables and listened to you talk about what you had built. I watched you treat me like I was lucky to be allowed among you. And I never said a word, because I did not know myself what was true. I only knew my father told me to wait. So I waited, through every cold word, through every closed door. Through the night, you slid those papers across the table and toasted my removal like good news. Her voice never rose. That was the terrible power of it. She spoke the way her father had spoken, low and steady, and the whole room leaned in to catch every word. You did not lose your wealth tonight, she said. You never had it. You were living in my father's house, spending my father's money, wearing my father's name without ever knowing you owed him everything. And now that account has come due. Obadele staggered back a step, reaching for a chair that was not there. Folisade's frozen smile finally cracked, and underneath it was something Thandi had never seen on her face before. Fear. She did not shout. She did not gloat. Her voice stayed low and even, and somehow that made it land harder than any scream. I am not here to punish you, she said. I am here to tell you what happens next. Within days, the lawyers came. Not Thandi's anger, just paperwork, cold and precise. The holding company that had quietly carried Obadele's business for 8 years called in what it was owed. Every asset Obadele believed was his was, on paper, the property of the estate, and the estate had one heir. Obadele tried to fight it. He shouted at lawyers. He demanded meetings. He waved his name around as if it still meant something. But a name is only worth what stands behind it, and what stood behind his had been Thandi's family all along. The big house, it turned out, sat on land held by the estate. The cars were leased through a company the estate controlled. Even the account that paid for that gold and white celebration drew from funds that traced back, in the end, to Solomon's quiet hands. One by one, the things Obadele had used to feel important were lifted away. Not stolen, simply returned to where they had always truly belonged. Folisade did not stay to watch it happen. The moment she understood the money was gone, the moment she saw there would be no grand house and no easy life, her love evaporated like morning dew. She packed the bags she had unpacked so eagerly, and she left without so much as a goodbye. She had never wanted Obadele. She had wanted what she thought he had, and what he had was never his. The last thing she said to him, standing in the doorway with her bags, was, "You told me you were a rich man." Then she was gone, and the door swung shut on the silence she left behind. Obadele stood in the empty hall for a long time, finally understanding that the woman he had destroyed his marriage for had never seen him at all, only what she could take. Baba Tunde, the proud man who spoke of family standing, found that his standing had been borrowed all along. The friends who once filled his table grew quiet. The invitations stopped. The men who used to shake his hand now looked through him as if he were not there. The respect he had worn like a fine coat turned out to be stitched from someone else's cloth, and now that cloth had been pulled away. He aged 10 years in a few weeks, sitting alone in a house that was no longer his, in a silence that grew heavier every day. Mama Ngozi, who had called another woman "my daughter," while a real daughter-in-law sat alone in the dark, found that her sharp tongue had no one left to wound. The house emptied. The compliments stopped. She was left in the quiet she had created. And Obadele, stripped of the business, the house, and the woman he had chosen over his own wife and child, finally came to understand what he had thrown away. He came to Thandi's door one evening, She had moved into a calm home of her own by then, far from the noise. He stood there, smaller than she had ever seen him, his fine clothes wrinkled, his pride gone. "Please," he said. "Thandi, please. I made a mistake. I did not know. If you had known I was rich," she said gently, "you would have stayed. I understand that now. That is the saddest part, Obadeli. You did not leave because I had nothing. You would have left a poor woman just the same. You left because you had no honor, and no money in the world can buy a man that." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in all the years she had known him, he had nothing clever to say. "Do you remember," she asked quietly, "the night your mother was sick, and I sat in that chair beside her bed for 3 weeks? You thanked me once, one time, and then you forgot. I did not. I have carried every kindness I gave this family, not because I wanted it counted, but because I needed to know I had given my best. I gave you my best, Obadeli. You gave me divorce papers across a dinner table." He had no answer. There was none to give. "I will not be cruel to you," she went on. "My father did not raise me to be cruel. The child I carry is yours, and I will never keep that truth from them. When they are old enough, they may choose to know you, if you become a man worth knowing. That is up to you, not to me." She paused at the door. "But you will not come into my life again uninvited. You made your choice at that table, in front of everyone. I am simply living with the choice you made." And she closed the door, softly. Not in anger, just closed it. The way you close a book you have finished reading. The seasons turned. Thandi's home sat near the water, simple and bright. The kind of place her father would have loved. No gold, no show, just clean light coming through wide windows and the sound of waves in the distance. The baby came on a soft spring morning, a girl, healthy and loud, with her grandfather's calm eyes. Thandi held her daughter against her chest and wept, not from sadness but from a fullness she had no other way to release. She did not become a different woman with all that wealth. She stayed soft, the way she had always been. But she learned that soft and strong could live in the same heart. She gave quietly, the way her father had. She funded schools in small, dusty towns like the one she came from. She helped young women who had nothing behind them, so that one day they might have something. She did it all without her name attached, the way Solomon would have wanted. On the wall of her new home, in a simple frame, she hung the envelope, the one her father had given her, the one she had carried for years, unopened, through all those cold seasons. The wax was broken now, the paper soft and worn, but it hung there in the morning light, where she could see it every day. Sometimes she would stand in front of it with her daughter in her arms, and she would tell her about a quiet man named Solomon, a man the world thought was small, a man who knew that the loudest people in the room are rarely the strongest, a man who taught his daughter to wait, to stay gentle, to keep her dignity even when others tried to strip it away. "Loud men inherit nothing," she would whisper to her sleeping child. "But patient hands, my love, patient hands inherit everything." And in the quiet of that bright home, far from the long table and the cold laughter and the divorce papers slid across the wood, Thandi finally understood the gift her father had given her. It was never just the money. Money can be lost. Money can be taken. Money turns people into strangers, the way it had turned Obadele and Folasade and a whole family into people she no longer recognized. The real inheritance was the lesson. The strength to sit in a room full of people who called her nothing, and to stay whole. The patience to wait for the truth instead of begging for it. The grace to walk away without becoming the very thing that had hurt her. That was what no will could contain, and no betrayal could take. That was what she would leave her daughter, long after the billions were spent or given away. Outside, the waves rolled in, slow and steady and sure. Inside, a baby slept in her mother's arms, safe, wanted, and loved. And the woman they once called Nothing smiled, at peace at last. If you believe patience is strength, type "Patiently moved you." Don't forget to like. Another powerful story is waiting for you on the screen.